Hi everyone, and welcome to the Handy Philosopher channel. Um, this is going to be part 5 of the never-ending Gorgias reading. We're almost there, and whilst it's long, I find it quite enjoyable, so hopefully you do too. Um, in this section, we're going to see uh, so Callicles kind of giving up on the argument. He becomes a bit of a whinging you know, uh, arguer and just sort of says, "Oh, I've just been saying yes all along when I don't really care what you're saying, Socrates," and which is a bit disappointing because if you remember right from the outset, um, Socrates has said, well, you challenge me if you think I'm going wrong, you let me know. So what we're going to see in this section is a couple of different things that that are said that are all sort of working towards the one goal. So, firstly, we're going to see a discussion about the difference in when we're talking about pleasure, not just discussing pleasure from the point of view of um, the amount of pleasure that you get, the quantity of pleasure, but also, and more importantly, we're going to see the discussion beginning to turn to the quality of the pleasure that we have. And this is how Socrates is going to re sort of reaffirm that argument that pleasure cannot be the same as good, as quite often we do pleasurable or distressing things in order to achieve the good. So if it is the goal, it like the goal is not the same as the method, or um, yeah, that'll become clearer as we're reading through. We're going to see the return of the argument around a expertise versus a knack, and we're going to see this is when the discussion will come back around to what was discussed right at the start, um, which was superior, the life of rhetoric or the life of philosophy. And what we're going to see is Socrates suggesting that philosophy is an expertise, whereas rhetoric is a knack, and this is why philosophy is superior to rhetoric. Um, and then we're going to start getting the sort of the last part of Socrates' argument, which is to do with the importance of organization and how organization quite often leads to the good. And he's obviously going to use this to say that, well, philosophy allows us to have an organized mind. And from that organized mind, quite often we are able to see good from bad, and it helps us to not get diverted just by what's pleasant or what's distressing. Okay, essentially, philosophy allows us to focus on what is good for us instead of just what we find pleasing. Okay, we get quite a few long, you know, um, monologues from Socrates in this one, so bear with him. He does love a chat, as I do, so I understand it. But we're going from section 500A, I believe. No, sorry, not quite 500A. 499C actually. So sorry about that. 499C and going to 505B in this section. Okay, so starting from the italicized part, right at the bottom of one of the pages, and this is so Callicles shifts from commending mere quantity of pleasure to admitting that there are qualitative differences between pleasures. This allows Socrates to reintroduce the distinction between means and ends. He argues that pleasures are those whose longer term effects. Sorry. He argues that better pleasures are those whose longer term effects are good, which in turn confirms that pleasure is not the good, since the good is something pleasure can aim for. The good life then becomes a matter of foresight. not immediate feeling response, and therefore arguably requires expertise. Socrates reminds Callicles of his earlier distinction between empirical knacks, whose goal is pleasure, and true branches of expertise, whose goal is the good. He counts rhetoric as a knack and criticizes all the great figures of Athenian history as mere flatterers of the populace, before sketching an outline of what true rhetoric would aim to do for its audience. In short, the expertise required to enable someone to live the good life is not the rhetoric Gorgias, who's the sort of this person that they've heard speak, held in quite high regard, is not the sorry. Gorgias practices and teaches. So basically, what Socrates is going to say is he is going to draw a distinction between what he would say is good rhetoric and bad rhetoric, but he's basically going to say all rhetoricians that are around today are actually bad rhetoricians because they're there just to give their audience a type of pleasure instead of trying to instill the good in their audience. That's sort of how this section is going to end up. All right, so uh, yeah, as I said, the first part here is going to be focused on um, a separation between instead of just the quantity, how much pleasure we have. And if you remember the jar argument, this is the idea of, well, it doesn't matter that the water leaks out of the jar. I get a lot of pleasure by filling the jar, and so I should just be trying to fill the jar all the time. So I should be trying to have a jar that's filled with holes so that I can continually fill it and get that pleasure. But is this really good for us? Like, would we say that that's a life well lived? Arguably no. So here we go, highlighters at the ready, and we'll start with Callicles. I've been listening to you for quite a while now, Socrates. I've been saying yes on cue, but what I've been thinking about is the adolescent delight you take in seizing on any concession someone makes to you, even if he means it as a joke. Do you really think that I or anyone else would deny that there are better and worse pleasures? And oh no, you're behaving terribly, Callicles. First you claim that such and such is the case, and then that it isn't the case. This is the way you treat a child, and it's so dishonest. I set out on this discussion in the belief that you were my friend, and so wouldn't deliberately deceive me. But as it turns out, I was wrong, and now I've got to make the best of my situation, as the old saying goes, and accept this offering of yours. It seems that what you're saying now is that there are better and worse pleasures. Is that right? Yes. Well, beneficial pleasures are good and harmful ones are bad, aren't they? Yes. Aren't they beneficial if they have a good effect and harmful if they have a bad effect? Yes, I agree. So notice here Socrates is talking about not what you experience, okay, whether you are experiencing pleasure or distress. The question you need to be asking yourself is, what effect is this having? Okay, is what I am experiencing having a positive effect on me or a negative effect on me? Is this making me a better person or a worse person? Um, are you thinking, for example, of the physical pleasures of eating and drinking that we were talking about not long ago, of how some of them make the body healthy or strong or good in some other way? Would you call pleasures of this kind good and those which produce the opposite result bad? Yes, that's it. Does the same go for unpleasant experiences? Are some good and some bad? Of course. Good experiences are the ones we should be going for, shouldn't we? Whether they're pleasant or unpleasant. They're what we should be concerned with, aren't they? Yes. And hadn't we better avoid bad ones? Obviously. Yes, because Polus and I decided, as you may remember, that the good in some form or other should be the reason for doing anything. Do you agree? Do you think, as Polus and I do, that all activity aims at the good, and that the good should not be a means towards anything else, but should be the goal of every action? Are you going to support us and make it three? Yes. Okay, so that section there, Socrates is really getting Callicles to confirm what he's going to use as a premise later on. Okay, that everything we do should aim at the good. This is a very similar argument to what we've heard in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, that this idea that everything we do aims at happiness, but not the pleasure-based happiness, that flourishing happiness. Now, Socrates and Aristotle certainly don't agree on everything, but it's a similar sort of idea that our aim in life should be something more than just enjoying the situation we're in. We should be trying to enter into situations that actually make us better people. Okay. Um, uh, okay. Yes. It follows that the good in some form should be the goal of pleasant activities as much as of any other kind of activity, rather than pleasure being the goal of good activities. That's right. So again, important point. Instead of putting pleasure as the goal, which is what Callicles had been arguing previously, we should do things that give us a sense of pleasure. It really doesn't matter what type. We should actually have the good as our goal. And if we experience pleasure on the path to the good, then that's great. But if we don't, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, because our real goal in acting should be um, to achieve the good. Uh, Now, is just anyone competent to separate good pleasures from bad ones, or does it always take an expert? Okay, so now we're going to start seeing the discussion shift towards expertise versus knack. Just to give a little bit of background, the first two dot points on the slide here, I've sort of tried to explain the difference. So expertise requires like focused study and training, and Socrates is sort of going to say we should really hold the views of people who are experts to be highly valuable, because their views usually aim at the good. And a good example of someone whose views we should value quite a bit is someone like a doctor. Okay, their we should hold their opinions around health at least to a very, very high regard. Okay. These people have studied a lot and they've dedicated their lives to understanding what creates good health and bad health. And so we should value that opinion. A knack is something that we can learn sort of relatively easily. You can muddle your way through it and still get a pretty good result. And the reason that we still get a pretty good result is that a knack is usually aimed at pleasure. Okay, so if I'm just trying to make people happy, I can quite often do this quite easily. It's much harder to actually make the people around me better people. That's quite a difficult feat to achieve. And so, um, the example we're going to see Socrates using in this is, along with several, actually, this is quite a long section, and Socrates is going to give lots and lots and lots of examples of expertise and knacks. So stick with it. The first one I find to be the best, and that's the separation between a doctor and a cook. Okay, so if I'm worried about my health, and particularly if I want to be in good health, if that's my goal, to be in good health, then I could talk to a doctor about what sort of food and how much food I should be eating, or I could talk to a cook about what sort of food I should eat. Now, what's likely to happen is that the doctor is going to give me advice, probably advice that I don't want to hear about what sort of food I should be eating. Um, and it's probably going to be one that I'm not going to enjoy all that much, but it is aimed at good health, and this is why it's so valuable. It's aimed at the good. Whereas the um, the cook is probably going to tell me about pleasurable things, like how to eat pleasurably, what sort of food is really pleasurable. And so their goal is probably going to be around pleasure and not actually towards the good and me achieving good health. Okay, so this is one example. Socrates is going to give several. Some of them are aimed at achieving the good for the body. Others are aimed at achieving the good for the mind. This is why he uses so many examples. But they all work basically the same way. And expertise is aimed at achieving the good, and a knack is usually aimed at achieving pleasure. Okay. Um, So I'll sort of start this part again. Now, is just anyone competent to separate good pleasures from bad ones, or does it always take an expert? It takes an expert, says Callicles. So have a look at this rant from Socrates. Here we go. I think we'd better remind ourselves of another view I happened to express while talking to Polus and Gorgias, as you may remember. I held that there are some procedures which are restricted to pleasure. That's all they have to offer, and which fail to distinguish between better and worse. But I also held that there are other procedures which do know what's good and what's bad. I proposed cookery as a typical example of a procedure which is concerned with pleasure. And I called it a knack rather than an area of expertise. And medicine as a typical example of an area of expertise which is concerned with what is good. Now, for God's sake, Callicles, and for the sake of our friendship, please don't think it's all right for you to play games with me and answer my questions any old how without caring whether you contradict what you really think. And at the same time, please don't treat what you hear from me as if I were playing games with you. Are you somehow unaware that there's nothing which even a relatively unintelligent person would take more seriously than the issue we're discussing, the issue of how to live one's life? The life you're recommending to me involves the manly activities of addressing the assembled people, rhetorical training, and the kind of political involvement you and your sort are engaged in. But is that the right way to live? Or is this philosophical life of mine better? And if so, what makes it better? So perhaps it would be best for us to distinguish these two ways of life along the lines I tried out just now. And then once we've agreed that they're different, we should try, if there really are two ways of life, to see how they differ and which of them is the one to follow. Anyway, you may not yet have understood my point. No, I haven't. So Socrates is returning the argument back to, well, which one should we value more, rhetoric or philosophy? Because if you remember, Callicles was quite demeaning of philosophy and the philosophical life at the start of the reading, whereas Socrates is quite demeaning of the rhetorical life. So which one should we value more? So Socrates. All right, I'll try and explain myself better. You and I have already agreed that there's good and there's pleasure, and that the good and the pleasant are not identical. We've also agreed that there are certain processes and procedures for obtaining each of these two ways of pursuing, respectively, pleasure and the good. But before I go any further, I'd better find out whether or not you accept even this. Do you? Yes, I do. All right then. I wonder whether you'll also go along with the idea I suggested to our friends here. That is, I wonder if you thought at the time that I was right. I told them that to my mind, cookery was a knack rather than a branch of expertise, as medicine is, and I went on to say that one of these processes, medicine in fact, had considered both the nature of the object it looked after and the reasons for its action, and could therefore explain its results. Pleasure, however, is the sole point of the other one's attention. There's absolutely no expertise involved in the way it pursues pleasure. It hasn't considered either the nature of pleasure or the reason why it occurs. It's a completely irrational process. It hasn't itemized things at all, so to speak. All it can do is remember a routine which has become ingrained by habituation and past experience, and that's also what it relies on to provide us with pleasant experiences. So just to pause here for a moment, we're starting to see Socrates really developing the difference between expertise and knack, and earlier in this little piece that we're reading here, Socrates brought up basically the idea of organization, which he's going to elaborate on later. But expertise requires a certain level of organization by the individual. And what we mean by this is in medicine, he says that they have looked at the nature of the object and the reasons for its actions. So basically, they understand the organization of the body and the way the body works. And this is why they're able to aim at the good, because they have taken the time to understand the function of the body. Whereas cooks, they don't spend any time looking at the function of the body. Um, all that they do is they make things that make us feel good and feel, well, not good, but feel a sense of pleasure. And then they repeat that process. Okay. So they have a habit of doing this. If you're wondering sort of what we're talking about, if you've ever done any French cooking, uh, this is the perfect example. If you can find me a recipe for a French dish that doesn't involve an extraordinary amount of butter or cream, then you know what? Good, good on you, because that's quite a feat. So the French have developed this habit, and quite rightly, people, hold up French cooking as being delicious. Yeah, it's delicious because they're adding butter and cream to absolutely everything that they cook. They've built the habit of just doing this in every dish. And why do they do it? Because they know that it makes it taste really good. It's going to be awesome to eat. Of course it is. It's got a ton of butter and cream in it. Okay, so that's what he's meaning by habit and past experience. Well, last time I did this, man, I enjoyed that meal so much. So I'll try adding butter to this meal and see if I enjoy it. Yeah, you will. This is what sort of Socrates is getting at in this section about the difference between expertise and knack. All right, so do you think this is a satisfactory account? That's the main question. And then I also want to ask whether you think there are practices whose province is the mind rather than the body, and which are analogous in the sense that while some of them involve expertise and work out in advance what will be best for the mind, others don't care about that and, as was the case with cookery, have restricted their thinking to how the mind gets pleasure. Not only have they not given any consideration to whether there might be qualitative differences between pleasures, they're simply not interested in anything except gratifying the mind, whether that is to its advantage or disadvantage. The point is, Callicles, that I do think these practices exist. And I maintain that pandering like this to the pleasures of the body or the mind or whatever, without taking into consideration the question of better or worse, is flattery. Uh, but what about you? Do you endorse these views of mine or disagree? Callicles now starts to become, if you pardon the phrase, a little bit of a douche, and he basically he's checked out of the argument. But I agree, as a favour to Gorgias, and so that the discussion isn't left incomplete. So he's basically saying, I don't care what you're saying, Socrates. Yep, sure, I agree with what you're saying. Um, Now, can this only happen to one mind at a time rather than to two or more? No, it can happen to two or more. So if there's a whole crowd of people, it's possible to gratify all their minds at once without considering what's best for them. Is that right? I'd say so. Can you tell me which activities have this effect? Perhaps it would be better for me to ask you specific questions and for you to tell me whether or not you think the activity I've mentioned does have this effect. Is that all right with you? Let's start with playing the reed pipe. Do you think it belongs to this category, Callicles? Is its sole purpose to give us pleasure without worrying about anything else? Um, I think so. Uh, and so on for all related activities, like playing the kithara in competitions. Yes. And what about training choirs to sing dithyrambic poetry you've composed? Don't you think it belongs here? I mean, do you think Synesius, the son of Melis, is the slightest bit interested in having his works improve his audience rather than in finding a way to gratify a packed theatre? Well, it's clear, at least in the case of Synesius, that he's only interested in giving pleasure, Socrates. What about his father, Melis? Do you get the impression that when he's composing music for the Kithara, his objective is to maximize his audience's moral welfare? Uh, Actually, it might be truer to say in his case that he doesn't even aim at maximizing their pleasure, since they find his singing offensive. Oh, Socrates. But anyway, what do you think about Kathara music and dithyrambic poetry in general? Do you think they were invented to give pleasure? Yes, I do. What about that grand and awesome pursuit, the composition of tragedies? In other words, sort of writing plays or stories for the public. What is the object of its efforts? Do you think the point of its earnest endeavors is merely to please the audience, or does it also struggle to avoid expressing sentiments which, for all their delightful charm, are morally wrong, and to include in its speeches and songs sentiments which are actually harsh and beneficial, whether or not people enjoy hearing them? Which of these two purposes do you think tragedy is designed for? Well, there can be no doubt about that, Socrates. It's more interested in pleasure and in gratifying an audience. And isn't that more or less how we described flattery a short while ago, Callicles? Yes. Remember, by flattery, Socrates means just telling people what they want to hear. Um, Next, suppose poetry was stripped of its music, its rhythm, and its meter. We'd be left with words, wouldn't we? Of course. And words spoken, in fact, before a large crowd, before the assembled people. Agreed. Uh, Poetry is a kind of popular oratory, then. So, oratory is just a fancy word for public speaking. I suppose it is. And popular oratory is just another way of saying rhetoric. I mean, I don't think poets and rhetoricians, don't you think poets are rhetoricians of the theatre? Uh, I do. So we're faced here with a kind of rhetoric which is addressed to the assembled population of men and women and children all at once, slaves as well as free people, and it's a kind of rhetoric we find we can't approve of. I mean, we did describe it as flattery, um, and Callicles says that's right. So Socrates here has gotten Callicles to agree that rhetoric is essentially like poetry if you take the elements of poetry like the rhyme and the meter out of poetry and you're just left with speaking in front of groups of people. Well, that's what rhetoric is. It's speaking in front of groups of people. And Socrates is saying that, well, in the same way that poetry is really just there to please people, isn't most rhetoric there just to please people? And Callicles has agreed. So um, rhetoricians are basically the poets of, they're just operating in a different type of theatre. Um, all right. What are we to make of the kind of rhetoric which is addressed to the Athenian assembly and the assemblies of other states, which are attended by free male citizens? Do you think that when rhetoricians speak, they want what's best for their audience? Do you think they intend their speeches to have the effect of perfecting their fellow citizens? Or do you think they're really no different from poets? In other words, that their objective is the gratification of their fellow citizens, and that the common good means less to them than their own private concerns? Isn't there, to your mind, something patronizing about the way they restrict their dealings with the members of these assemblies to trying to gratify them, and don't take the slightest interest in whether or not they made better or worse people in the process? There's no simple answer to this question as there was to the other one. So this is Callicles replying, there are speakers who are motivated by concern for their fellow citizens, but there are also others who answer to your description. So this is important. Callicles isn't quite giving up the fight yet, okay, because he can see what Socrates is doing. He's trying to get him to agree that all rhetoricians aim at pleasure. And Callicles is saying, well, I'm not going to fall for this trap. Certainly, some rhetoricians, when they speak, are there just to flatter the crowd, and they're there just to say what people want to hear, basically either stroking their own ego or pandering to the crowd. And so their goal is pleasure. But he's saying there are some who do aim at making society better. And so we can't say for sure whether rhetoric is always a knack or an expertise because it's sort of showing elements of both at times. And Socrates here says, that's all I need. If the activity is twofold like that, then one of its two aspects is presumably flattery and popular oratory of the contemptible sort, while the other is the admirable procedure of trying to perfect the minds of one's fellow citizens and of struggling to ensure that uh, that the speeches one delivers have the highest moral content, whether or not it makes people enjoy listening to them. But you've never come across this latter kind of rhetoric. If you can think of any rhetoricians who fits this description, why don't you tell me his name? So essentially what Socrates is saying is, okay, fine, I'll admit that there's some that fall into both camps, but can you tell me the name of anyone who falls into the camp of actually trying to make people's lives better? As in someone who actually tries to achieve the good for their audience. Um, and Callicles replies with, I certainly can't think of any contemporary rhetoricians anyway. Well, can you name a single rhetorician from the past who's supposed to have been instrumental from his first public speech onwards in changing the Athenian people from the terrible state they'd been in before to a better one? If you can, please do so, because I don't know who it is. Uh, and then Callicles replies with a few names here. But what about Themistocles? People say he was a good man, don't they? And then there are Cimon and Miltiades and Pericles, who's only recently died, and you actually heard him speak. Yes, Callicles, they were good men, all right. That is, if your earlier description of goodness was true and it consists in satisfying your own and others' desires. But if that's not the case, if there's some truth in the conclusions the subsequent discussion led us inexorably towards, uh, and we should satisfy only those desires whose fulfillment makes us better people, not those whose fulfillment makes us worse. And we decided that this whole area was a matter of expertise. Well, can you say that any of the men you mentioned were good in that sense? Uh, Callicles then replies with, I don't know what to say. So Socrates is not just going to admit that these people were good because Callicles says. He's basically saying, were they? Really? Uh, because Socrates is questioning whether they fit the definition of an expert or someone who aims at the good that they came to earlier. Okay. Uh, so Socrates now starts sort of toying with Callicles a bit. You'll come up with something if you search in the right way. Let's take an unhurried look then and see whether any of them were good in that sense. Now, speeches delivered by a good man, someone who wants what's best of his audience, aren't aimless but have a purpose, don't they? It's the same with all other craftsmen too. Each of them that bears in mind his particular task and so doesn't select and apply his materials aimlessly, but with the purpose of getting the object he's making to acquire a certain form. So I'll just pause here for a moment because this is now the last little bit of the argument we're going to see in this section from Socrates, and the role of organization. It's a really important point that we need to understand because it's crucial to the benefit of philosophy in life. Socrates is going to argue that philosophy is what helps us to organize our mind and discipline our mind to pursue the good instead of just what's pleasant, whereas the life that Callicles has endorsed earlier is really just aimed at pursuing self-indulgent pleasures, and so lacks the organization to tell the difference between good and bad pleasures. Okay, so again, Socrates is going to argue this at first via analogy, and he's going to start talking about craftspeople and the way that they organize things so as to create something that is good. Um, uh, and then he's going to start applying this to philosophy and rhetoric. Okay. Um, so if you need examples, look at painters, builders, shipwrights, any craftsman you like, in fact. Each of them organizes the various components he works with into a particular structure and makes them accommodate and fit one another until he's formed the whole into an organized and ordered object. Uh, so here we've got the first little inkling of the connection between organization and the good. That's what all craftsmen do, including the ones we were talking about not long ago, who deal with the uh, oh, sorry, I've flicked the wrong way in my book. Um, sorry. Uh, Not long ago, who deal with the human body. Trainers and doctors, I mean. They order and organize the body in a way, and we are in agreement on this. Sorry, are we in agreement on this or not? I dare say you're right. So Callicles has agreed that the role of, for example, a doctor is to organize the body. And it might sound a little bit weird, but if you think about it, doctors run tests and they say, oh, you're deficient in this, you need to eat more fish. Or, won't you take this supplement to try and increase that? So they are actually looking at the organization of the systems of the body. Um, so it takes organization and order to make a house good, doesn't it? Does it? And without these qualities, any house is worthless. Yes, and the same goes for ships. Yes, and for our bodies too, we're saying. Yes. What about the mind? Can a disorganized mind be a good mind, or does it take organization and order to make the mind good as well? Uh, we have to think so. The preceding argument leaves us no choice. Uh, Now, what do we call the effect of organization and order on the body? Callicles says, I suppose you mean health and fitness. Yes. Next, then, what do we call the effect of organization and order on the mind? What's the equivalent term to health in this case? Can you come up with one? Callicles, getting a little bit bored of Socrates' questioning, sort of says, why don't you just tell us yourself, Socrates? All right, I will, if that's what you'd prefer. If you think I'm right, please tell me. But if you think I'm wrong, don't let me get away with it. Show me why I'm wrong. In my opinion, we describe the processes which organize the body as healthy because they cause health and whatever else constitutes a good physical state. Is that right or not? It is. And we describe the processes which organize and order the mind as law or convention because they make the mind law-abiding and orderly, which is to say they imbue the mind with justice and self-control. Agreed? I dare say you're right. So, important here. Socrates has managed to get Callicles to agree that the controlled or self-disciplined mind is actually the good one. This is opposed to the argument he presented earlier that it's the self-indulgent mind which is good, the mind that seeks to pursue pleasure. So now Socrates. So these are the qualities which that excellent rhetorical expert of ours will be aiming for in all his dealings with people. Uh, with people's minds, whether he's talking or acting, giving or taking. He'll constantly be applying his intelligence um, to find ways for justice, self-control, and goodness in all its manifestations to enter his fellow citizens' minds, and for injustice, self-indulgence, and badness in all its manifestations to leave. Do you agree or not? I agree. You see, Callicles, what's the point of giving someone whose body is ravaged by disease lots of wonderfully pleasant food or drink or whatever, if that's not going to increase his chances of getting better in the slightest, or on the contrary, is even, as an impartial view suggests, going to decrease them? Am I right? I dare say you are. Yes, I can't see that life is worth living if a person's body is in a terrible state. He's bound to have a terrible life, isn't he? Yes. Now, isn't it normal medical practice to allow a healthy person to satisfy his desires? Sorry, excuse me. Excuse me. A bit of a sneeze. Now, isn't it normal medical practice to allow a healthy person to satisfy his desires by eating or drinking as much as he wants when he's hungry or thirsty, for instance, but almost never to let a sick person have his fill of what he desires? Do you agree with me about this? Yes. So, interestingly, Socrates here is starting to say we can actually allow people to fulfill as much pleasure as they want, but it has to be the right kind of person. Okay, because someone who is focused on maintaining health in their body, if I gave them free rein to eat whatever they want, they would still eat the right amount of stuff, and more often than not, they'd eat the right stuff. Okay, because their goal in eating is health, not enjoyment. Right? And if they decide to indulge in enjoyment, this is the type of person who can stop at just having one piece of chocolate. Okay, I'm going to get that little burst of enjoyment, but I'm not going to sacrifice the true goal of what I'm aiming towards, which is health, just so that I can experience pleasure from eating. Okay, they're aiming for the good instead of just the pleasant. Um, so, yes, the same goes for the mind, doesn't it, Callicles? As long as it's in a bad state, which is to say ignorant, self-indulgent, immoral, and irreligious, we must prevent it from doing what it desires and have it keep strictly to a regimen which will make it better. Do you agree or not? I do, because that's actually better for the mind, isn't it? Yes. Now, to prevent it from doing what it desires is to discipline it, wouldn't you say? Yes. So discipline is better for the mind than the indulgence you were recommending not long ago. Okay, so Socrates has dismantled a lot of Callicles' argument in this section. Okay, he's gotten Callicles to agree that we shouldn't just be aiming for as many pleasures as we can in terms of a large quantity of pleasures, but we should actually also be aiming towards a certain quality of pleasure. We should be aiming for pleasures that make us better people, okay, or that aim towards the good. Socrates has identified that rhetoric is actually a knack, and that rhetoric is really only there to bring pleasure to the mind. It's kind of like listening to poetry. If we were to take the rhythm and the meter out of poetry, it would just be words spoken to a group of people to make them feel pleasure. Socrates compares this to rhetoric and refuses to accept any of the examples that Callicles gives of rhetoricians who he thinks aims at the good. Okay, so at the moment they haven't agreed on anyone who actually aims at the good in their rhetorical deliveries. Okay, when they're speaking in front of people. So Socrates has argued that rhetoric is a knack and it aims at pleasure instead of actually aiming at the good, which would be the role of expertise, which soon he'll identify philosophy as being. And then finally, um, what the key element of how we actually achieve the good is through organization. If I want to become healthier physically, then I need to understand the organization of my body, what my body is lacking, and then try and correct for this. So I need to organize my body better and sort of balance it better. Okay, so I need to take certain vitamins which I might be deficient in and that sort of thing. I'm sure we can all understand what he's talking about here. And this will then produce the good goal of health. I might not enjoy it all the time. Okay. And more importantly, I might not be able to indulge every enjoyment I have. But once I've reached that disciplined state where I am healthy, and if my goal is to maintain health, then I can be allowed to um, indulge myself because I've now developed the discipline to not ruin the good with pleasure. In other words, I'm not going to ruin my health by just eating chocolate if I've actually achieved the desired state, which is a disciplined mind. Okay. So a few things covered here. It was a bit of a longer one, but if you've had a look, there's not much left to the reading. So the next recording will be quite short for the last section of Gorgias. Um, Hopefully you're enjoying it and not becoming a Callicles and becoming sullen and bratty and just not actually getting involved anymore. Uh, yeah, one more recording to go for Gorgias, and I'll see you next time. Have a great day. See you in class.